got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride, and she don't care.
And we're back once again with the second episode of Ticket to Ride, my review of the Ryde-Eastwood Open that I played recently. This is my round 2 game against International Master George Xie. I'm black in this game. George is a very strong player. He's obviously an International Master. He's actually got all 3 of his GN norms required for the title, but hasn't yet got his rating over 2500 that's needed for the title. At the moment his FIDE rating is 2440, his ACF rating is 2460, he played ball 3 for the Australian Olympiad team, so obviously a very strong player, and in some ways a very good opponent to play, because not only do I really not have anything to lose, there's no sort of expectations that I'm not really expected to get anything other than a loss against George. But also very good from the point of view that I know he's going to be playing strong moves that forces me to play better moves. Things that I might be able to get away with against lesser opposition, he's not going to let me get away with, as you'll see from what actually happens in the game. So it starts off he opens up with d4, and I play g6 in modern defence, as I've been playing a fair bit recently, and he plays the knight c3 line. Here I'm happy to go into what's known as the Gurgenitz variation, with the idea being pawns on c6 and d5, and try and sort of hopefully induce white to push e5 and basically end up with an improved version of the advanced French, where you don't have the problem of having this sort of awkward bishop stuck on c8. The idea in this line that after you play d5 you're going to be able to get the bishop out either to f5 or g4, possibly even swapping off for a knight on f3, which is what actually happens later in this game, and slowly we'll work up and build pressure on the d4 square. So c6 also gives me the flexibility of going into a perk proper, so I could play, if I wanted to, from here d6, knight d7, follow up with e5, that you might find in a normal sort of perk defence rather than playing the modern. George plays f4, the Austrian attack, and d5, and e5 is how George followed up. So here for black, I've got obviously these pawns on the king side on white squares. The d5 square is obviously a white square, so I want to actually put all these pawns in a pawn chain on the white square. So I want to end up eventually playing e6, but in much the same way that you play like a Caro-Kann or something like that. You want to get this c8 bishop out first before playing e6 and fixing that pawn structure. So what my plan is here for black is to get this black bishop, this bishop on c8 out, either to f5 or g4. The preference being swapping the knight for the swapping the bishop for the knight. So if whatever plays knight f3, I'm going to play bishop g4 and take it as soon as possible, pretty much, and then look to play on the queen side with moves like c5 being the big break that I'm looking to play. Here I play h5, again in that idea of putting the pawns on white squares, and it's also a useful move. White hasn't committed to doing anything with his pieces at present, but it helps for what might come later on. Often this f5 square is a key square, so you might often have say knight might go via h6 to f5, and then the issue becomes controlling this g4 square, and that pawn on h5 helps to do that. This is something where I made a bit of a mistake later on, as we'll see, by not securing this f5 square. But h5, useful move, keeping up with the themes. It looks like you might be weakening the king side, but there's no real obvious problems with it. The king doesn't have to go to the king side. The king might go to the queen side depending on what happens later on in the game. So White plays knight f3, and as I was saying before, immediately I want to play bishop g4 and try and swap that bishop for the knight. White plays h3, which I'm more than happy to see, because this is obviously something that I want to do. I want to swap the bishop for the knight. And here play recaptures with the queen, which is fairly logical. e6, fixing the central pawns. So now my big break is going to be c5 on the queen side. White's going to be playing for this f5 square. Bishop d3, logical developing move. And here I made a bit of an inaccuracy, which is something that George punished me for. What I need to do now is ensure that White's break on the king side with g4 is not possible. So the move I really need to play now is h4. Yes, the pawn is a little bit loose there, but with the rook on the h-file, the queen obviously protecting it as well, it's not very easy to attack. You might eventually, say, play a move like bishop e3, bishop f2, and maybe maneuver the queen around to e1 to protect it. By that time, again, I have that same plan of trying to get that knight into f5. I'm not actually too concerned about something like the bishop capturing on f5, because again I can recapture with the pawn, and again I've got these pawns on white squares, they're solid. It's not really a concern. I can maybe put some pressure down the g-file. The point of this pawn on h4 is that if white ever tries a break with g4, I simply capture en passant, and this leaves white with a potentially vulnerable h-pawn. Obviously it can be a bit double-edged, in that if we do get to an ending where, for example, he swapped the bishop for the knight on f5 and I don't have that g-pawn, it's a question of whether that potential passed h-pawn there is going to be a weakness or a strength. To my mind, at least, it's probably a lot easier to hold up, so it can become something of a liability for white. And then with sort of this, the theory being, I get this good bishop ending with the bishop on the black squares and all the pawns locked in the center on the white squares. It's going to be a good ending for me if I get into that sort of position. Having said all that, I didn't play h4, and you can see in this game what happens when I don't play a move like that I really need to play at a particular time. You've only got one or two moves as far as opportunity is concerned, and George really punishes my failure to play h4 in this game. So instead of playing h4 after bishop d3, I played knight e7, which is a fairly logical developing move, obviously headed for this f5 square. It could also go out via h6, but I'm more than happy to go on to e7. Also gives me the flexibility, if I want to play a later c5, that this knight on e7 can then come to c6. So it sort of gives me that extra option. I might have this kind of plan in mind, and this knight on b8, instead of coming to c6, it might actually go to d7 and help support the key c5 square. So after this knight e7, bishop e3, fairly logical developing move, helps control c5, and again this is my last real opportunity that I get. I really need in this position to play h4, again to stop this break on the king side. Against some other opponents, they'll often do things like castling here and maybe give me an opportunity to play h4, and again I've been able to get away with this sort of thing against lesser opponents because they aren't playing as sharply. So I played knight d7, something that I've played in the past, the same type of thing, and opponents that aren't as strong as George have basically let me get away with this sort of inaccuracy of not playing h4 and sort of fixing the pawn structure on the king side and preventing that g4 break. So typically some of the opponents that I've played here would say castle king side or queen side, and we get this sort of slow strategic battle where the knight pair is actually better than the bishop pair in the closed center for the most part. George doesn't give me this opportunity, he plays g4 immediately. obviously the break that he wants to get in. Queen b6 attacking the b2 pawn, so George simply castles to defend. I can see what's going to happen on the king side, so I get my king out of the way, and he plays f5. And here I make another inaccuracy. At the time, I thought that keeping the h-pawns on the board would probably be better for me. However, in hindsight, given the space advantage that white has on the king side, what I should be looking to do here is take on g4 and then take on f5 and basically liquidate everything on the king side. I don't mind if a set of rooks get swapped off. I don't mind being sort of somewhat passive, because my play is going to come on the queen side, and that's what I'm looking for in this position. So as far as liquidating the king side, it's going to be I'm probably still going to be a little bit worse just because of the space in the center and obviously the space on the king side that white has, and the fact that I haven't really got things going on the queen side yet, but I wouldn't be unhappy with that position. However, instead of doing all that, I played g takes f5 immediately. Mightn't be so obvious immediately what the problem is, but we'll see later on. Obviously, recaptures. I can't really allow the pawn to get to f6, so I either have to do something with the bishop or the knight, or trade on f5. I could possibly do something like bishop h6, but again, I'd prefer to keep that bishop if at all possible, and I really didn't like the idea of knight g8 or something like that, and then having white play f6 and sort of have this awkward position where I don't have much space at all. So I decided to take on f5, and George, again, not wasting time with sort of recapturing the pawn. He knows he's going to be able to recapture that at any moment. He played rook g1, a very good move, attacking that key bishop in the position. Obviously bishop f8 really doesn't look like a move I want to play. Disconnects the rooks, makes myself really passive, asks for a move like, say, bishop g5, and really sort of locking down the position, something that I really don't want to have to do. So I'm really pretty much forced to play a move like bishop h6. So black's more than happy to swap bishops and then play bishop takes f5. The problem, obviously, now that I have, is that my f7 pawn is really, really weak and not very easy to defend. Obviously now, with the bishop on f5, the rook can't go back to h7 to defend. I can't play f6 immediately because of tactics. We're sort of taking on d7, and then the queen protects it, so I'm losing the pawn there. If I play a move like, say, rook f8 to defend, then I might have problems with my king, potentially maybe taking on d7 and bringing my king close to the center. Alternatively, white might just play something like rook g7 and sort of again pile up on that weak f pawn. So it is a liability, and it's really not very easy to defend. So I ended up playing knight takes f5. White obviously recaptured, then I played rook f8. Rook g7. Again, exploiting this problem of the f pawn. Now I can't play f6 because I dropped the house on d7. Obviously there's queen takes or rook takes, and everything's falling apart really easily. So I simply have to accept that I've lost the f pawn. In this situation, what I want to try and do is find a way to get the most favourable endgame possible where I'm a pawn down. Again, as I was saying before, in this position, the h-pawns are actually a liability for me here, because the h-pawn is always going to be a bit of a weakness for me. And if the h-pawn ever gets lost, obviously white with the e-pawn as well as the h-pawn being passed, it's going to be a big problem. So again, this goes back to this idea from earlier that I want to liquidate the king side completely rather than leaving a set of pawns on. So queen d8. What I want to try and do here is, if at all possible, swap as many pieces as I can and try again to maybe a rook ending a pawn down or a knight ending a pawn down, and ideally be able to blockade that e-pawn. So if I can find a way to swap some heavy pieces and put the knight on e6, get my king around to e7 or f7 or somewhere like that, my chance of holding are probably pretty reasonable. Now, obviously, I didn't actually get a chance to do all that, so we'll see what happens. So we swap on f7, and here I played, again, this idea that I wanted to get the knight to e6. I actually played knight f8, which turns out to be a bad move. Better move in this position would be queen g5 check. The idea being queen g6 after the king goes to b1, again swapping pieces, trying to get the heavy pieces off. The queen doesn't really have many squares that can stay very close to where it is now. It can really only play to e7 if it wants to stay sort of up near my king, in which case I can simply play a move like rook h7, and that sort of gets the queen out of the area completely. So white's options there are either the swap queens on g6, which again helps with the control of the e6 square. So I've got ideas now playing knight f8, knight e6 to blockade. Alternatively, white might play something like rook f1, and I'm sort of happy to try and liquidate again. So sort of swapping queens, and then maybe playing a move like king d8 with the idea of king e8 to get the rook out of there, and again with that further idea of knight f8, knight e6 at some stage, and sort of trying to hold this pawn down ending. However, isn't what happened. I played knight f8, and it was only after George's next move that I realised the big problem with it. George played rook g1, and this is the big problem with my move. Initially the plan, knight e6, runs into rook g8, and I'm losing at least a piece, if not more. So I have to go to plan B, and I need to stop the rook coming to g8, so rook h8 to stop that. Obviously now that allows the rook to come to g7, and in some ways it's a good thing because I can play queen d7, which helps swap off a set of heavy pieces. The problem being that after the exchange, my pieces aren't in the ideal squares that they want to be. It's not going to be very easy for me now to actually get the knight back to e6 that I wanted to. If I play knight f8 and I want to actually cover that e6 square, I then have to worry about rook g6. If I want to cover rook g6 first, if I ever leave the back rank, there's sort of rook g8 ideas. The king needs to stay over with the queenside pawns. The e-pawn might get pushed at some stage. So I have got the position I want, but my pieces are really in an awkward spot, and they aren't really in a position to properly defend this position. So white plays the logical knight e2, heading to the f4 square, which is a great square. Obviously controls the e6 square, attacks the h-pawn. Might also want to go to g3. So rook f8 to try and stop that knight f4 idea. But now that I've taken the f8 square away from my knight, white simply plays e6. I thought this mightn't have been so bad for me. Obviously my king's still very close to the pawn, so I was hoping to be able to get the king across to help defend and maybe round up the e-pawn, but then I have problems with not only defending my queen side with the b-pawn, but the h-pawn becomes a big problem as well. So knight b6, threatening to come into c4, and then maybe I can come back to d6 or come into e3 and start doing anything, but George simply stops that immediately with b3, cutting off the squares for the knight. So I look to reroute the knight, my knight a8. So I want to come back to c7, again attacking this e6 pawn, and hopefully I want to try and round it up, but again George doesn't give me the time needed. Knight g3, again attacking the h-pawn. I did for a while think about pushing the h-pawn, but I thought that white would just simply play knight e2 and then rook to the h file, and I'm really tied down in that position. There's not a lot that I can, not productive, that I can do without getting myself into a further tangle. So I played knight c7. I was more than happy to trade the h pawn for the e pawn. But here George plays e7, threatens the rook, rook f3, knight takes h5. So the initial idea that I had of playing rook takes h3 in this position runs into some problems with knight f6 afterwards. And then I have the problem that I've got to worry about losing a piece, or giving up a piece on e8 to prevent the queenie, and I'm still got a problem with the rook being on the 7th rank. So I played knight e8 immediately, stopping that idea, and then now if I get a chance I can play rook h3 safely, but then white plays rook h7. So tactically things hold together. So if rook takes h3, knight f6, threatening the rook, threatening the knight, and yeah, I really didn't want to go in for that. So king d7 again to try and cover the pawn, king d2, and then again another little mistake by me. I actually played king to d6. Better move in that position might have been knight d6. Similar in some ways to the game, however the knight on d6 helps control that b pawn, at least temporarily. What happens after king d6 is that what plays knight g7. Obviously if I swap, I'm going to run into problems with the b pawns. Say if knight takes, rook takes, and then just e8 and rook takes b7 and rook takes a7, similar in some ways to what happened to the game in the game. So I took the pawn on e7, white swap knights, and then takes on b8. I take an h3, and I'm now two pawns down in the rook ending, and my king's stuck on the back rank. So very difficult to defend, and George's technique's pretty good here. King d8, obviously I'm trying to get across to help stop the a pawn. So George eventually just pushes it down the board, throws in a check so that if I go to the c file, you can simply bring the rook back on the b file, probably to b4, and then just play a7 and promote. And it's either going to, at the very least, tie up my rook to a very passive position. So I was going to say, if I go to the c file and he comes back on the b file, I then have to, it still ends up with my rook being passive, so I'd have to play something like rook h7 and rook a7. However, if I did go to a8, then the rook goes to c7, attacks the c pawn, and he's still threatening to at some stage push the a pawn. So simply rook e7, I go back to b8, a7 check forces me into the corner. Now rook c7, so he ends up getting that position anyway. The problem now is that if I defend passively with something like rook h6, there's a pretty simple plan for white, just to go king c3, king b4, king c5, and pick up the c pawn. And given that I can only move the rook or the pawn, which I'd lose for free anyway, there's really not a lot I can do. So I tried rook h1, again same kind of idea, king c3, rook a1, rook takes c6, rook takes a7. I thought if king takes, then simply very similar to what happens in the game is king d6, and I'm sorry, rook d6, and I'm in trouble anyway. Still plays rook d6, temporarily trying to defend it with rook a5, and then king b4. Rook a2 is a last try, but simply c3. I'm losing the d pawn by force, 3 pawns against 3 pawns and a rook against the rook. So yeah, that's where I finally resigned. So again, this idea that a small inaccuracy in the opening, obviously not playing h4 when I had the opportunity, and not liquidating the king side completely, those two weaknesses combined with George's sharp attacking play really meant that George was able to finish it off fairly convincingly. So that's episode 2. We'll be back in the next few days with further episodes for the Ticket to Ride series. Hope you enjoyed that. This is Melbourne Games Coach signing off. Remember, melbournegamescoach.blogspot.com. Thanks.